everybody! Let me warn you in advance, this is a recipe that can damage your sausage making gear. So if you're gonna try and make it, pay attention and be very careful. I'm making imitation Slim Jims, so let's get started. So long as I can remember, I have never had an actual tailor-made Slim Jim. But my good friend David has asked me if I can make them, and the short answer is no, I cannot. More on that later. But I should be able to make something close, so let me give this thing a try and see what the Macho Man was all about.
The cream of the crop!
Check out that bite. The casing is definitely more tough than it is snappy. Alright. Well, the flavor, pretty generic. It's not horrible. There's just some kind of red pepperiness to it. And salt. It's got an interesting, tiny little bit of sweetness to it. And this has definitely been fermented or has some citric acid in it because it is quite tangy. So that's not very complicated. Let's see what they actually put in here. Beef, pork, and chicken, the holy trinity of processed meats. Oh, there is some corn syrup in here. Paprika and paprika extract. Lactic acid starter culture, so there's some fermentation going on here. Barley malt extract, that's going to be another sweet ingredient. Oh, and also citric acid and cure. So pretty simple. There are some things here that I don't have around here, and I never will, but I think we can do all right. Now, texturally, this thing is a nightmare. This casing is more tough than snappy. Could probably tie that in a knot if it was any longer. And there is something off about the grain of the meat. Let me cut this open and see what's inside. Okay, it's definitely beyond what I would call a fine grind. It is really finely ground or pureed, but there's something in here, a little chunk of something right there. What is that? Okay. So I think what's going on here is that they have taken a fine meat, almost paste, similar to the infamous pink slime, but then they've added in some pre-dried, jerky-like bits of meat I can see in there. And I just tried them, and those are definitely harder than everything else. If I had to guess, that is what they've done. And for me, that is not very pleasant. I have a fair idea of what's gone into this stick. Now let's see if I can make a similar, or hopefully better, version of it. If this works out, I'll make a batch of these using venison, but I'm not about to use my good venison on an experiment. So for today's recipe, we're using beef, pork, and chicken, a combination you're gonna find in a lot of commercially made processed meats. So I've got a tri-tip here, I've got the fatty part of the pork shoulder over here and a couple of big old chicken thighs. And the first thing I'll do is to trim and separate as much of the fat from the meat as possible so I can get a fairly accurate measurement on the fat content. And this one does come in at 31%, which is pretty high. So if I can't get it with these meats alone, I always have a nice bag of fat scraps laying around that I can supplement that with. I'll take this membrane off of the tri-tip, even though I am positive that that would not happen in a sausage factory. That would go right in there and add to the chewiness.
Oh yeah!
So I've trimmed up the meat here and got it somewhat separated, and this is gonna be one fatty daddy. So the next thing to do is get this all chopped up and then run it through gnarls. And I'm gonna run most of it through this very fine 3mm plate for the kind of mushy bits, and then I'll run a portion of it through this much coarser 6mm plate for the chewy little bits.
Maybe I am insane. Maybe I am insane. And maybe it's time for you to find out how insane I am. Yeah.
Now let's take a look at the cure and seasoning for these skinny sticks. And here I have the salt and the cure, that is pink cure number 1. Now here's an ingredient that I've never used in a sausage, but it is one of the ingredients listed on the package. So I've got some corn syrup. Now as far as flavoring goes, the package shows paprika and paprika extract, which is a very expensive ingredient used partly for flavoring, but even more so for giving everything a sort of red color to it. And I don't have any paprika extract, and I'm not planning on getting any soon. So I'm just going very heavy on the paprika. And I've got the good stuff today, but you use whatever paprika fits your budget. And apart from that, the package just lists natural flavoring, so I'm kind of winging it from there based on what I tasted in that. So I've got some chili powder, and that's a blend of ground up chili peppers and some other seasonings. It had a little bit of bite to it, so this is some cayenne pepper. And a little bit of garlic is always good in a sausage, so I've got some garlic powder here. And this is some onion powder, and you want to go easy on that stuff. It's a lot stronger than it seems. And finally, for just a little bit of zhuzh, I have some ground fennel. And the package also shows that they've used some lactic starter culture in there, some bacteria to give it a tart flavor. So I have some of that here. This is Bactoferm LHP, and this is a starter culture that works under a wide range of temperatures, and it also works very quickly. So I'll be using a little bit of this in here today, and I need to feed this starter culture. So here I've got some dextrose, which is essentially a very, very fine sugar. And this is such a fatty sausage that a little protein boost is going to help to bind that. They've used soy protein in that product, and I do not have any soy protein, and that's another thing I don't plan on getting. So for a little protein boost and binder, I have just regular old store-bought non-fat powdered milk. And to help mix that and get it through the stuffer, I'm going to be using just some plain old water today. And I'm gonna need to keep this one kinda loose because it's gonna be difficult to stuff. Well, I've run into a bit of a snag with the recipe this week because it seems that when I was upstairs gathering all my ingredients, the dog got in here and ate all the casings.
And that's enough to get me hot.
These are not something that I can get locally, so I'm going to have to order these and pick this up a little later. But it's not that bad because I've got the meat weighed, I've got all my ingredients weighed, so I'll just mix all my dry ingredients together. I'll store that in the refrigerator to keep it fresh. I'll just get some new corn syrup when I pick this up. The starter culture, I won't mix in. This you can store in the freezer for over a year, so I'll just pop that in the freezer and we will pick this up again next weekend. And in the meantime, I'll be looking to pick up about an 18-foot mamba out there in the yard somewhere. Oh, man. And just like that, a week has passed. I've got my new casings, so we are ready to mix this one up. I already had my meat weighed and my spices and cure measured. Got some fresh corn syrup there. But the first thing I want to do, about 15 minutes before I mix this up, is to rehydrate the starter culture. And to do that, I'm just going to put it in about 1/4 cup of room temperature water, non-chlorinated water, and we're just going to dissolve that in there and kind of bloom it the same way you would do with yeast while you're baking. And a little bit of this starter culture goes a long way. This 42-gram packet is enough to ferment 225 kilos of meat. So just take what you need out of here, then you can store this in the freezer, and it's good in there for at least a year, but I've used it even after that. I'll just use a portion of the water that I'm going to use to mix this with. Just a little bit. And I'll just lightly stir that. I'll just set this aside while I get the mixer set up. Now, if you've been watching the channel for a while, you already know what I'm gonna say, and that is that when you mix a smoked sausage like this, you need to mix the heck out of it. Whether you're using a mixer like this or doing it by hand, you gotta mix that stuff until it gets nice and shaggy and very, very sticky, which can take you 15 minutes or so if you're doing it by hand. With this, I can usually do it in around 5. Looks like we're just about there. Starting to move like one big mass now. It starts to look a little doughy. You can see it's very shaggy looking now. And yes, super sticky. And that means you've got some good protein extraction, and that leads to good binding. And now, instead of putting this meat into the refrigerator overnight to let the cure work its magic, I'm going to get this one into casings right away. And now we can talk about the reason I can't actually make a Slim Jim at home. These are the collagen casings that I normally use when I'm making snack sticks. These are 21mm casings, and I'll use a 15mm horn to stuff those. But today, I'm going down to these 16mm sausage casings. And the issue with using narrower sausage casings is that the smaller they are, the more force it takes to crank them out of your stuffers. Now, I haven't actually measured this little Slim Jim, but I'm going to guess that's somewhere around the 10mm range. And there is no way I'm going to get that through my stuffer. That is going to take some industrial grade gear. Even with the 16s, it's probably going to be pretty tough. Now, there are a couple of things you can do that'll help get these stuffed. A little extra water in your mix is going to make it go through there a little smoother. And using a horn like this 12mm horn that I'm going to be using today that has this tapered end like this instead of the sort of flat bell-shaped end on there, that's going to help push that through a little bit easier as well. And even at that, it's going to be pretty difficult. But the last thing you want to do is go full macho man cranking on your sausage. If you find yourself pulling on that thing really hard, working up a sweat trying to get your meat down through that hole, you got to change something up. Either switch to a bigger casing or try to loosen up your meat somehow. Otherwise, there is a good chance you're going to wreck your gear. And the reason I'm going to stuff this now, rather than letting this meat cure overnight outside of the casing, is that when this meat cures, it is going to become very firm, and it's going to be that much harder to get down and through your stuffer. And when you add the fermentation on that, it is going to be even more stiff. It almost has the texture of cooked meat at that point. And there is no way you're getting that stiff meat down through that little hole. So I'm already working against the clock, so now it is time to lock and load and crank out this skinny salami.
Oh yeah!
Well, I'm going to say that actually went pretty well. And again, I stuffed these up while that meat was still nice and soft before it's cured, so that helped a lot. And I don't generally tie off the ends of these, but since I haven't used this exact casing before, I'm going to go ahead and be safe and tie these off. And with a Snag stick like this, you do want to stuff your casings pretty full. Not tight, but pretty full. Not like a natural casing that you're going to link up. You want to leave some slack in those, but these, make them nice and full, or they're going to get some kind of funny looking wrinkles in them when you smoke them. It's not going to hurt anything, it's just going to look a little weird. And now if you ever get down to the bottom of your stuffer there and wonder how to get that last little bit of meat down and through there, here's a cheap and handy little tool. These are some soft silicone eggs. And you just toss those in there, put it back in your stuffer, and it'll push those eggs right down and through and get all the meat out of there that's possible. Welcome into the sausage closet, where our sausages are now hanging to cure and ferment. And now we're into a little bit of unexplored territory, because having never used this particular casing before, I can't be certain how well they're going to hold up to hanging in here for the full ferment time. Once they start to ferment and cure and firm up, I'm not too worried about them. It's just in this beginning stage where the casing is still nice and supple that I would worry that they might fall apart. Now, they are not supposed to fall apart, so I'm going to have to trust that. But I did set up some racks below there to catch them if they do. I'll come out and check them in a little while. If they start to come apart, then I'll lay them down flat to cure. They're just going to look a little funny in that case. So I'm going to put the temperature in the sausage closet at around 80 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. The warmer it is, the faster those things are going to ferment. And I'm going to give them about 14 hours, I think. Just sort of a random time. I got to go do some stuff in the morning, and I'm going to be back here in about 14 hours. I've also got a lot of humidity going here. I just kind of crank that humidifier all the way up in the sausage closet. You don't want those casings drying out, because then they're not going to be able to breathe and let that stuff ferment. Now with the summer sausage, I will pierce the casings a whole bunch to let air get in there to help fermentation, but I tried it with a little section of these and that definitely made them break. So I'm just going to hope that by keeping enough humidity in here, they'll be able to breathe enough and ferment. And if they don't, they're still going to cure and they're going to taste great. They just won't have that tartness to them. These have been in the sausage closet now for 15 hours, so it's time to check them out and see how we did.
That's what you're talking about right there.
Well, they look pretty good. Definitely not overly dried out. Still kind of soft. They're looking great. So now it's time to move these out of the sausage closet and directly into a 130-degree smoker. Now I've moved these out into the smoker. Like I said, we're going to start at 130 degrees Fahrenheit. We don't need to start at that really, really low temperature to dry them out because they're already nice and dry. I've got some water down in the water pan, and I am running hickory smoke today. Oh, these aren't going to take a ton of smoke. They're smaller sticks, so my smoke schedule today is going to be 1 hour at 130 degrees. I'll bump it up to 140, give them another hour, then bump it up to 150, probably hold them there for 2 hours, and then we'll bump it up to 180 for the final cook-off. So we're probably looking at about a 6-hour smoke time. So I guess I'll go watch some football. And now these have been smoking for a full football game. That's just about 4 hours. And they're looking good, so I'm going to turn the temperature up to 180 degrees Fahrenheit to finish cooking them off kind of quickly. I've got a temperature probe down into the center of one of those, and they'll be done when they hit an internal temperature of 155 degrees Fahrenheit. We have hit that internal temperature of 155, and now it is very important to get these out of here and cooled off just as quickly as possible. And normally I would dump them down into an ice water bath, but it's very cold out here today, so instead I am just gonna blast these with the garden hose. This water is icy cold. I'll just give them a minute or so. That'll get them well on their way to cooling off. And then I'll pop them back into that icy cold smoker to let them finish cooling down all the way. And we are back in the sausage closet for the final drying stage. Now, once you get the moisture off of them from cooling them down, they're good to go, ready to chow down on. But if you want an extra snappy casing, then you can leave them hanging out at room temperature or below for several days until that casing dries out even further and gets a real hard pop to it. It's really up to you where you decide to take it. And I'll leave them hang here in the sausage closet. It's going to be around 55 degrees Fahrenheit in here. I'm going to have a fan going under them to speed up that dry out. But you can also just put them out in the refrigerator uncovered for several days or even longer in the refrigerator until they get to where you like them. So I think I'll leave these maybe 2 days here in the sausage closet, and then they should be pretty snappy. And there's some evidence that a mouse may have gotten into the sausage closet, and that just can't stand. Now let's see how we did. Well, it's definitely not as slim as the gym. Of course, what really matters is the taste. Check out that bite. That is a good snap. The casings did very well. They are a tiny bit tougher than I usually make them, but I imagine that's from the extended hang time in the sausage closet. But they're still not nearly as tough as this thing. There's plenty of fat in here, but it also doesn't have a greasy texture like the Slim Jim kind of does. I'm gonna get this out and compare. Ooh. That flavor is pretty close. Heavy paprika. It's a tiny bit of heat. Personally, I'd like a lot more heat, but that's a different sausage. The fennel is a difference, but I love it, and it's very subtle, and you can absolutely leave that out if you want to be closer to the original. This one is very lightly fermented, so it is not as tangy as the Slim Jim. I could give it more time to ferment, but that would probably continue to toughen the casings. Or I could add in a little bit of encapsulated citric acid like they did, and that would get it there as far as tartness. But all in all, it is a great little snack stick that I'd be happy to make again, and there is no question whatsoever that it is far superior to that. This is probably close to how a fresh Slim Jim tastes before it's been packaged, sterilized, and then hung around at the gas station for months. Quite good indeed. It's nice. Admittedly, this stick was a huge pain to make, and most of that came down to the smaller casing. But after a couple of botched attempts, I think I got the technique down for this. But if you want to avoid the hassle, just use a larger casing and you're going to have a great snack stick. But if you insist on narrow meats only, and do give this one a try, Admittedly, this stick was kind of a pain to make, and most of that came down to the smaller casing. But after a couple of botched attempts, I think I've got the technique down for this. But if you want to avoid the hassle, just use a larger casing, and you're gonna have a great snack stick. But if you insist on only the narrowest meats and do give this one a try, just remember, you've been warned. Admittedly, this stick was a bit of a pain to make, and most of that came down to the smaller casing. And the dog's love of smaller casings. But after a couple of... Admittedly, this stick was a bit of a pain to make, and most of that came down to the smaller casing, and the dog's love for the smaller casings. But after a couple of botched attempts, I think I got the technique down for this. But if you want to avoid the hassle, just use a large... Admittedly, this stick was a bit of a pain to make, and most of that came down to using those smaller... Admittedly, this stick was a bit of a pain to make, and most of that came down to the smaller casing and the dog's love of smaller casings. Admittedly, this stick was a bit of a pain to make, and most of that came down to the use... Admittedly, this stick was a bit of a pain to make, and most of that came down to using these smaller casings, and the dog's apparent love of smaller casings. But after a couple of botched attempts, I think I've got the technique down for this. But if you want to avoid the hassle, just use a larger casing, and you're gonna have a great snack stick. And if you insist on only the narrowest meats and do give this one a try, just remember, you've been warned. But if you try and succeed, I know you're gonna love it. Admittedly, this stick was a bit of a pain to make, and most of that came down to using those smaller casings, and the dog's apparent love of small casings. But after a couple of botched attempts, I think I've got the technique down for this. But if you want to avoid the hassle and possible damage to your equipment, just use a larger casing and you're gonna have a great snack stick. And if you do insist on only the narrowest meats and do give this one a try, just remember, you've been warned. But if you try and succeed, I know you're gonna love it. Thanks for watching. Can't break one.